Hi, welcome to part two or chapter two of my looking at the book Consilience. Today we're going to be talking about chapter two, what Dr. Wilson calls the great branches of learning. It's another short chapter, but it's really going to set the stage for kind of how Dr. Wilson is thinking and what Dr. Wilson is thinking. This idea of consilience will do once envisioned, kind of in context both from an academic standpoint, and he also gives some social examples. And then we're going to also talk about those things and what they pertain to today. So this is hopefully should be around 35 minutes on the length. So look forward to speaking with you today about these ideas. This is a very old idea. This idea he mentions on chapter 8 is the greatest enterprise of the mind has always been and will always be the attempted linkage of the science and the humanities. So natural science that attempts to kind of break down and understand the natural world in as understandable ways as it possibly can, and as it can be, and the humanities, which deal with high culture and art and the human ideals that we have placed in story and song and in art, all come together in science. That's an old idea. It's an idea that has been around for a long time, and through this kind of push to understand and link the sciences and the humanities, we want to bring the Enlightenment back. He says we need to bring the Enlightenment back, but we need to understand why it failed in the first place, or why we branched off into thinking about knowledge, or thinking about learning, or thinking about the human condition as broken into different sectors, or our own sectors based on our own interest. Dr. Wilson does recognize that the Enlightenment was never really a unified movement, that even though it started with Bacon, it kind of moved on, and Descartes and Newton and all of the people that came after the original Enlightenment thinkers kind of had their own take, and Romanticism kind of moved the needle in a different direction. And so this is an old idea. This is an idea that has been around for a long time, of uniting the sciences and the humanities. Interestingly enough, I think some of the things that come to my mind is in the biblical series, Lecture 8, Dr. Peterson mentions that he thinks Carl Jung united science and religion in the 20th century, and Dr. Peterson says that nothing more important conceptually happened in the 20th century than that. And I think that's something very interesting to keep in mind for anybody who's listening to this who considers themselves a Jungian thinker. It's something that's very important to me, and kind of how these ideas come together. But when we look at this idea, we're talking about an intellectual call to adventure. This idea of consilience, the strongest appeal of consilience is the prospect of kind of an intellectual adventure, and if you have any modest success at that adventure, the value of understanding the human condition with a degree of certainty kind of increases. If you make your thinking consilient, if you join what it is that you know from science, and what it is that you know from the humanities, and what it is that you know from your own personal interactions, combining that thinking really drives forward your understanding of the human condition. The other thing that really sticks out to me is this idea of a call for adventure. There is a set of private schools or private/public charter schools in Texas called the Acton Academy, and they're all already kind of using this idea of the hero's journey in education, creating your own myth. This kind of idea of teaching learners, teaching students to think about the fact that they have the opportunity to create their own myth within their lives. And doing so, again, if you're consilient in that thinking, as you gain knowledge from multiple arenas, your understanding of the human condition increases. So it's a call to adventure. It's an opportunity to adventure. And again, I want to point out that that's something that immediately calls or causes meaning, or that is something that has the ability to give meaning to students, to teachers, to anybody who's engaging with these ideas. In my opinion, it's kind of like we're being called to the same kind of journey that the great discoverers of the 14th to 1600s were, or the Western settlers were called to. They were all called to an adventure, but this is an adventure of the mind. Wilson thinks that thinking with a consilient mind provides kind of this intellectual adventure that improved the understanding of the human condition. One of the things that kind of stands out to me when I read that, I'm also watching and going through Dr. Robert Sapolsky's Human Behavioral Evolution class at Stanford, which again, if you haven't watched those lectures on YouTube, you really need to. Dr. Sapolsky says that everybody should be made to take this behavioral evolution class at gunpoint. And kind of one of the questions that we have is, why do you need to do that? Why do you need to take these classes or think consiliently or learn to think with consilience? It's because we have a tendency to misunderstand the human condition. Not only our human condition, but certainly the human condition of others. We are the most complicated things that there are by a long shot. And so the reason everyone gets all up at arms when they're called a name is because they hate being reduced to that one single thing. We are complicated. We are not one single thing. So to explain human behavior, Sapolsky takes into account evolution, genetics, molecular genetics, behavioral genetics, ethology, neurology, endocrinology, and all of that to give this entry-level introduction to human behavioral evolution. All of those things work consiliently. And again, when you do that, that's why you have a chance to understand the human condition. The introductory lecture to Dr. Sapolsky's Human Behavioral Evolution lecture has over 1 million views, which I do find fascinating. I think it's very interesting that 1 million people have looked at this on YouTube, and it's something that for me gives a little bit of hope that there is an obvious desire to know these things or to learn these things. But it's also, in my opinion, powerful because it's consilient. If it were just a biology lecture, I don't know that it would have the same punch. If it was just a study on Darwinian thinking, I don't know if it would just have the punch. If it were just genetics or just game theory, which is mentioned ad nauseum in those lectures, I'm not sure it would have the same punch. But because it's consilient with so many things across so many disciplines, the theories, the thoughts, the ideas, the facts that Dr. Sapolsky shares in those lectures, they grow, they increase because they are consilient. So that's something to keep in mind. So how does E.O. Wilson lay out this happening? So he talks about taking intersecting lines and meet where we into 4 quadrants, and we're going to label one quadrant environmental policy, one ethics, one biology, and one social science. Now, if you're an intuitive person, if you're an I on the Myers-Briggs, if you're an intuitive person, meaning you interpret meaning, you go ahead and you bring meaning on to what it is that you're thinking. You put that out there. Those things are connected so that rational inquiry in one quadrant informs reasoning in the other 3. But that's not really how we think, and Dr. Wilson is mostly talking about in academia. In academia, in the way that we're taught, we kind of split these 4 quadrants up into their own buckets. Sapolsky would call them buckets. And there's good reason that we do this. This kind of gets back into this idea of Newtonian and Darwinian thinking. If you think in a Newtonian manner, if you think in a reductionist manner, especially a reductionist materialist manner, you are going to break things down into as many categories as you possibly can so you can understand what goes in that category and kind of remember it based on the fact that it's in that category. So Wilson is talking about our higher education, but in my opinion, take this for what it's worth, you can put about whatever you want to in those 4 quadrants and make this case, as long as they have some connection in some manner. But what happens, again, we split and we divide those things into quadrants. Those quadrants have their own thinking. They draw their own conclusions. They use their own language. So the people studying ethics, the philosophers, the thinkers, the social scientists, they develop their own language. The biologists develop their own language. The social scientists, and all of that kind of becomes disconnected with environmental policy, which is often its own world creating its own language, its own conclusions. Each of these quadrants develop their own modes of analysis and validation. How they validate things is different. So when you do that, the reductionist way of thinking, the reductionist way of breaking down your own language, developing your own language per each quadrant, really hampers communication between those quadrants. They don't really know each other's reductionist conclusions to the extent to be able to speak coherently about them, and so if somebody from biology makes a claim about ethics, people would discredit that claim because they don't know the ethical policies or the environmental policies or the social scientific policies. Bacon, again, kind of going back to Bacon, talks about why the Enlightenment died. So Bacon was a champion of this idea of consilience, and he kind of saw he very much, Francis Bacon, very much identified the most fatal error of consilience. He said it occurs wherever argument or inference from one world, wherever arguments or inferences from one world of experiences only lives itself out. So when we only look at something from one viewpoint, when you reduce something down to one viewpoint, one focus, one set of conclusions, it's a fatal error of human thinking. And I think that's something we see every day. Just to be real honest, I think something very powerful about this walk away movement from a political standpoint, from the Democratic Party, is very tied to the idea that people are tired of being broken down into one thing. Now again, I'm not making a political claim in either direction on whether or not that's right or wrong. I think what we're talking about here is the unity of knowledge, and that is something that is very interesting. It's very off-putting to some people to be reduced to one thing. That's the problem of the identity politics of the left. That is problematic for lots of people. Yes, the right has plenty of problems. Yes, we're dealing with interesting things with our president. None of that really focuses back on or takes away from the idea. It actually strengthens it, because when you are arguing or inferring from only one world of experience, you're going to be short-sighted in your thinking. There's no way not to be. And that applies to all political realms, all religious realms, all realms of human thinking that, again, totally put their head to the floor and reduce argumentations to that one thing. So what do we do? Kind of how do we get from here to where we've broken these four things into quadrants? How do we get them to connect? Okay. Well, you start drawing circles around the point of intersection. The closer to the intersection, the more unstable the region is. So as you get closer to the area in the middle, as you get into this area right here, those are the problems. Wilson says those represent all of the problems that we face in our daily lives, between connecting biology and ethics, connecting ethics to environmental policy, which for Wilson, again, is a very, very big component. If you know anything about E.O. Wilson, his environmental policy thinking is incredibly sound and incredibly intense. It's very intense. And again, the social sciences. So it's where all of these quadrants meet, where Wilson says the real world issues are. The problem that we have is there are no maps. There are no guides, there are no concepts or words of help to, it's only by imagination that we can travel kind of clockwise from the recognition of environmental problems. So the environmental problems that we have in this upper left-hand quadrant, we need sound environmental policy to combat the great plastic that we're dumping into the ocean, the rising sea level temperatures that make people get all up at arms about climate change and some of the environmental issues that we're having. We need sound environmental policy. So it's by imagination, really only by imagination, that we can kind of travel clockwise from the recognition of environmental problems and the need for sound environmental policy to the selections of solutions, because that's really what we want. We want solutions. Whatever we're trying to make consilient, whatever groups of thinking are specialties, or academic ways of thinking, or social ways of thinking, or academic ways of thinking, we're looking for solutions. We need to base our solutions on moral reasoning. If we have a solution for something that's this big, that's a big issue that we're facing, whatever it is, we need moral reasoning. We need biological foundations of that moral reasoning. And see, this is one of the issues that we face now in our world, our lack of understanding of biology, basic biology. Really puts a constraint on what we can do from a moral standpoint. Because again, James Hillman quoted, I don't know if this is his quote, but this is something I've heard him say before, is we are lived by powers we pretend to understand. And that is a very decent biological conception of humanity. We don't, even though Hillman was a psychologist. So solutions based on moral reasoning, the biological foundations for that reasoning, to move to a grasp of social institution, to a grasp of social institutions as a product of our biology, our environment, and our history, and then back to sound environmental policy. So when we look at this quadrant, there's a clockwise thinking that needs to occur, to where we need sound environmental policy because of the problems that we're having. These are Wilson's issues, where the first thing is, well, what morally are our obligations? As kind of as caretakers of the world, as caretakers of the earth. We're the only species that's conscious enough to do something about about the problems that we have facing our environment, or if you have trouble with the climate change topic, for whatever reason, at least I was talking to my wife's boss recently, and he was like, who cares whether you believe in climate change or not? Should we not be wanting to take care of the planet? So what's our moral obligation to the environment? And then to continue down, well, what's our connection to the environment? What as living beings, okay? What as living beings connects us to? What about our biology connects to the environment that we face or we see every day? And then what can social science and social policy, what can our institutions, what have they done thus far? What do we know that works? All of that is what leads to sound environmental policy. And it's this idea of consilience, that it doesn't happen out here. It doesn't happen out here, that the problems that we have exist right here where those quadrants meet. That's where we don't see eye to eye, and that's where we have to learn to be consilient in our thinking. One of the things that I find interesting is that Wilson says, this is not for the academic elite. This is for the educated public. And I find that to be very hopeful. I find that to be very kind of invigorating in a way that Dr. Wilson kind of trust in consilience is for the educated public. It's for regular people. You do not have to be this, thank goodness you don't have to be E.O. Wilson, because there's only one of him. There's only one of Dr. Peterson who's changing the lives of so many. There's only one academic elite. There was certainly only one Carl Jung. There was only one Freud. Those people don't come around, and the list goes on and on. It's kind of like saying, just because Mother Teresa was such a good person, so we don't have to be. This is a call for the educated public. Wilson again is going to hammer this, and he's going to hammer it for sure in the next chapter on the Enlightenment. But trust in consilience is the foundation of the natural science, of the natural sciences. He goes on to ask the question, what's the relationship between science and the humanities, and how is that important to human welfare? Now we need to really dwell on that. We need to dwell on that, because you think about the problems that humanity truthfully has right now, today. We have ethnic conflict. We have tribalism. We have this problem of poverty. We have problems with the environment. We have problems with our politicians. We have problems with this idea of, is what form of government moves us forward better? What form of thinking moves us forward better? Abortion, LGBTQ issues, all of these things that we struggle with daily, these problems that face humanity. Education, for me, education is, I have a hard time saying education is failing, because it's not failing everybody. But are we giving learners the best information, the best modes of living, the best ways of thinking? Are we giving learners this pathway forward to success? And a better question is, how can we answer these problems without thinking scientifically? Without thinking, and I'll even be more specific, without thinking biologically. Again, we are the most complicated beings that there are. So when you think in a scientific manner, I would say a biological manner is even more pressing, because it doesn't lead to the tendency of breaking things down to the smallest sum of the whole. In evolution, thinking in Darwinian terms, thinking about what it is that evolution has left for us to understand about ourselves, The one thing is there are a whole lot of adaptations. There are a whole lot of selection processes. There are a whole lot of genes that were selected based on individual selection, based on kin selection, based on reciprocal altruism, based on a different or change in environment. We also know that when we change our environment, we can start coding for different proteins that are stored in our DNA but haven't manifested themselves the same way. When we think in evolutionary terms, when we think in Darwinian terms, we see the connections with multiple parts of our past very easily, rather than saying we are X. We are, in a tribalist sense, we are Republican, we are Democrat, we are Christian, we are atheist, we are black, we are white. That's a reductionist way of thinking. And again, if you go back to Bacon, what Bacon says is looking at things through one lens, breaking things down into where you're viewing things at one lens is the breakdown of thinking. It's the breakdown of logic, especially in terms of the human condition, because it doesn't account for the whole. And people again get very, very upset very quickly when you reduce them down to one thing. When you reduce them down to say you are X, that just doesn't set well. Wilson is hopeful for this idea of fluency between the boundaries, fluency between biology and ethics, to where you can move back and forth between biology and the social sciences. Fluency between the boundaries will provide kind of a clear picture of kind of how the world is, how the world is, and not through this lens of one line of reductionist thinking that only talks about what biology says, or what moral reasoning says, or what the social sciences, one of your social sciences, say. It is all that reducing these arguments down to really serious questions we have about how we're going to educate people, how we're going to combat tribalism, how we can move forward to fight poverty. Focusing on one of these quadrants is a myopic response to for an immediate need to be right. Which is really good in debate. Like if you're debating biology or ethics in terms of environmental policy, being right is awesome. If you can really show the person you're debating whether you're right, man, that's fun. That's a lot of fun. I see all these people talking about debate. You won't debate me on this topic. Well, awesome, congratulations. The grown-ups really have to be out into the real world living, where we know we can't reduce the entirety of humanity to a specific worldview or an ideology or a religion because it doesn't account for the entirety of the person. It doesn't account for the entirety from an academic standpoint. It doesn't account for the entirety of the learner. And when you are reducing that, it's going to halt progress, because you go to your camp and I'll go to my camp, and we'll just sit there and sulk in what it is that we think we know, rather than having fluidity or seeking consilience between the things that we both know and understand. It seems Wilson and I would agree with this, thinks that we shouldn't piece by piece study sections of each thing that we are trying to make consilient. Okay? And I think that's an important thing to note from an academic standpoint. Right now, our factory-like education system is trying to make learners study piece by piece sections of subjects. There's way too much information. we have access to way too much information, and because of that, in my opinion, that's obviously an opinion, but if we're trying to make things consilient, it's really more important that we pursue kind of a way to think. We instead, pursuit of consilience, bringing a well-balanced perspective between the different levels of thinking. For Wilson, the great branches of learning. Thinking this way is a real path to diversity. This is another call to, kind of the diversity that America, the United States, has always dreamed of, always thrived on. Because if you are just focusing on this section of biology, and you're not thinking consiliently with the moral reasoning, if you're not thinking consiliently with what you learned about art, what you learned about music, what you learned about psychology, if you're not thinking consiliently with those things and you're only thinking in these reductionist terms, you will hit max capacity of information, and you won't be able to take any more information. And thinking in the terms of consilience, again, is the path to increasing our depth of knowledge. And again, thinking in this way gives ultimate purpose to you and your intellect. I've seen this in my life with this book and Dr. Peterson's biblical series and the study of Jung and the study of the Sapolsky lectures. They really have all of my study with the Carl Jung reading group and the work that my friend Skip does. Thinking about things in a consilient manner, truthfully, has increased my understanding of the human condition, both mine, my own personal understanding of my own human condition, and the sad state of affairs that is and was and always has been, to being a more understanding teacher, to being a more understanding coach. Very important to being a more understanding husband. It's, and this is Wilson's words, which if you follow Dr. Peterson, this is pretty funny. Doing this, thinking consiliently, ensures that order and not chaos lies beyond the horizon. And so those are my notes and my thoughts on chapter 2, the great branches of learning, and how E.O. Wilson wants to make those branches, or considers making those branches between the arts, or between the humanities, the natural sciences, and the social sciences. He wants to make those consilient. I want to make things consilient in the form of education. The more consilient we can become with behavior strategies, with learning strategies, with ethical strategies, with teaching about meaning and how to give life purpose, how to handle finance, how to handle relationships. We need to think in a consilient manner about academics, about education. Doing so, at the very least, will help our understanding of the human condition. Thank you for your time today. I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you have any questions or thoughts, feel free to leave it in the comments section. Have a good day.